Welcome to this course on the history of science from 1700 to 1900. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share a tour with you through two of history's most fascinating centuries. You know, I've run across a lot of folks who are curious about history of science, but they're often a little bewildered too. When I tell them I'm an historian of science, they'll say, "Gee, that's interesting." And then the next question frequently is, what exactly is it that you study? Well, that's what we'll discover in this course. But let me, right here at the beginning, make a few very general comments. During the 2 centuries we'll be examining, the 18th and 19th centuries, many important scientific developments occurred, and we'll be examining a rich sampling of them. But these 200 years also saw enormous social and political change. You'll come to understand, I hope, that the two worlds, the world of science and the world of society, don't really exist separately. They're intertwined, intimately intertwined. Each affects the other. We know that scientific discoveries can affect society directly. Think of electromagnetism, for example. That was a theoretical advance that made electric motors possible, and we know how significant they became. But the influence can go the other way, too. The presence of social values, for instance, determines what's interesting, what kind of questions get asked. And that goes a long way to steer the direction science takes and to discover and determine what discoveries get made. With all of the modernization that occurs in these 2 centuries, we have a fascinating task ahead of us. I'm going to tell you later in this first lecture what we'll be doing in the entire course. But before I get to that, I'd like to set the stage for the first part of the course, which is entitled Science and the Enlightenment. Come back with me for a moment to the year 1783. We're in Berlin, the capital of the German state of Prussia. Berlin was the site of a number of salons where intellectuals gathered, just as they were doing in France around the same time. If you pick up a copy of the Berlin Monthly, you'd read the prize question for the year. The journal is soliciting essays on the question, what is enlightenment? There's been a lot of talk about enlightenment lately. Apparently, the editor wishes to clarify exactly what it is. Now, I want you to notice something here. The question itself, what is enlightenment? That reveals a very important aspect of the time we've gone back to. I mean by that, a self-awareness of its status as an enlightened age compared to previous eras. This is so much the case that we in the present have identified the century as the Enlightenment. In fact, the Enlightenment marks the beginning of a longer period of Western history, what historians often refer to as the modern era. We mean by the modern era the period since the Enlightenment, marked by its commitment to discover truth and by its confidence in reason as the means with which to do it. Now, some people claim, as perhaps you've heard, that we're now beyond the modern era. We're living in a postmodern period. Well, if that's true, then it was the 2 centuries that constitute this course, the 18th and 19th centuries, which define what is meant by the modern era. There are other courses in our curriculum here at the Teaching Company that focus on the Enlightenment and on various aspects of both the 18th and 19th centuries, and I highly recommend them to you. In this course, we'll be examining how developments in natural science helped to forge this new modernism. Now, one of the entries in the Berlin Monthly's prize competition was submitted by a professor from Königsberg, way over in East Prussia, one Immanuel Kant. In his answer to the question, what is enlightenment, Kant said that it was characterized by waking up to a realization. What realization? Well, the realization that we humans have created realms separate from ourselves on which we then have become dependent. Kant said that we've erected transcendent religious realms, heavenly regions we invest with meaning, and then we defer to these realms because we believe they make claims on us. Kant said enlightenment involves having the courage to discern this and to act on it by getting rid of what he called self-imposed dependency. A couple of years earlier, Kant had written a book that emphasized the role human reason plays in permitting humankind to stand on its own feet. What's interesting to us in this course is that Kant himself was vitally interested in natural science. Many of his early years of study had been dedicated to it. In fact, prior to the age of 36, Kant's writings dealt primarily, although not exclusively, with the natural sciences. Kant certainly respected the power of natural science to acquire positive knowledge. To be sure, he also made clear what he thought were the limitations natural science operated under. But Kant was a champion of natural scientific knowledge in his day. Now, he wasn't alone in this respect for the power of reason. Many thinkers of the age were impressed with the human capacity for rational knowledge. In fact, among the achievements that convinced them of this were the remarkable strides of the natural philosophers of the previous century. The thinkers of the Enlightenment looked back to the 17th century with a certain degree of hero worship. By the time the 18th century drew to a close, for example, one of the greatest symbols of the power of reason was Isaac Newton's success. In our next lecture in this series, we'll learn how it was that Newton's stature grew over the course of the 18th century to this symbolic position. But before I introduce you any further to the course as a whole, I want to examine a preliminary question. Historians like to ask preliminary questions about what they're doing. I'm afraid I'm no exception. Here's my question. Does an examination of the science of the past pose any special challenges to the historian? I think it does. My reason is that we in the present generally have a very specific understanding of natural science. And that could be a problem. Why? Because in my view, it would be a mistake to assume that the natural philosophy of the past necessarily resembles the natural science of today. And that's very easy to do without thinking. Historians are always insisting that to do justice to a past era, we have to try as much as possible to treat it on its own terms. Let me illustrate why this is so important by telling you a story about one of the most important scholars of recent times I know of. I'm thinking of the great historian and philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, whose work on historical scientific revolutions brought the terms paradigm and paradigm shift to such prominence in our culture. A paradigm, in Kuhn's use of the word, refers to the set of assumptions held consciously and unconsciously that constitute a way of seeing the world. Now, he came to this notion through a revelation he had relatively early in his career. He was sitting in the bowels of Widener Library at Harvard one summer afternoon reading Aristotle. Now, Kuhn had been trained as a physicist, and as a result, he was having trouble understanding how Aristotle could have thought about nature the way he did. It just wasn't making any sense. Then suddenly it dawned on him. Aristotle was not writing bad physics. He was writing good Greek philosophy. It was from a realization like this that the concept of a paradigm and the sympathetic reading of texts emerged in Kuhn's thinking. Kuhn realized that to judge Aristotle on the basis of contemporary knowledge was not only unfair to him, it communicated a false sense of the past, and it could make one miss the wisdom Aristotle did have to offer. We have to put ourselves into the shoes of those figures from the past if we're going to understand them. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's extremely easy to impose present standards onto the past where they don't belong and don't help us understand it. And it's especially easy to do that when the subject matter is natural science. Consider this, for example. If I use the word scientist, I have great confidence that we all know what I mean by the term. But can I accurately call a man from the 17th century, for example, Isaac Newton, a scientist, when there wasn't even a person of that kind in the society of the time? I can't do that because there were no scientists. if I use a word for a practitioner of natural science when no one in the society of that time held that role, then obviously I'm misusing the word. Further, when one gets to know Newton, it quickly becomes clear that much about him, for example, his devotion to alchemy, would disqualify him as a scientist in today's meaning of the term. Terms like scientist or scientific community, then, belong to contemporary perspectives, what Kuhn would call modern paradigms. They bring with them hidden assumptions that just don't fit the 17th century. Now, I'm going to do my best to avoid such mistakes, but it's hard, very hard to do. In fact, I think it's impossible to refrain completely from taking our own perspective with us as we investigate the past. The cultural inheritance we possess as citizens of the 21st century can show itself in extremely subtle ways. Not long ago, for example, I was consulting a book I wrote some years ago, and I found myself in that book referring to Newton as a scientist. Now you know why I've chosen this particular example. The reference was innocent enough, but at the same time very revealing about what qualities I'd brought to the study of Newton, whether they belong there or not. Okay, so it's very hard to see past people and events on their own terms. Let's not let that difficulty traumatize us. I don't want to let this impossibility keep us from trying to understand the past on its own terms. We'll do our best, knowing in advance that some of the present will likely leak through to the past as we construct our historical analysis. So let's begin. The first thing I'd like to introduce you to are the major institutions of natural science in the 18th century, the ones in Britain, France, and Germany. They played a big role in shaping the way in which individuals pursued knowledge about nature. In Britain, there was the Royal Society, which had been established back in the 17th century. Back then, and even into the 1720s, it had been led by great men, Isaac Newton, for example. But by the middle of the 18th century, it was waning in its influence. There were several reasons for this, but a major one was that it had never been funded by the Crown, so it had to depend on the wealth of private members for support. What that meant was that there was no guarantee that the wealthy men who were happy to belong, and even happy to help pay the bills, had any scientific talent of their own to contribute. By mid-century, the major focus in natural philosophy was in France. There, the Academy of Sciences, also established in the 17th century, did enjoy government support. And in France, not only the wealthy ended up with positions in the Academy, it was possible to rise in the Academy on the basis of merit. And that, as you can imagine, was an incentive for many an aspiring natural philosopher. So the Academy harbored a wealth of scientific talent. In addition to the Academy, whose meetings were not open to the public, you couldn't just walk in off the street and hear a paper being delivered, there was also the King's Garden. Again, it had been founded in the 17th century. By the 1780s, it included a botanical institute, a nursery, laboratory facilities, and a popular public park accessible to a quarter of the population of Paris. What that meant was that the public did have relatively widespread access into the grounds of the institution. Even more, you could actually attend public lectures and exhibits on natural scientific subjects. The French Revolution, which commenced with the convening of the Estates General by King Louis XVI in 1789, eventually led to major disruptions in leading French organizations of natural science. There were dire consequences of this development, including the loss of some natural philosophers to the terror during the Revolution. But by 1795, just prior to the emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte into French politics, natural science was largely reestablished again in newly reformed institutions. What about Germany? In the German states, I need to mention more than just the appearance of a new institution. There was also a general cultural upsurge in the second half of the 18th century. You know already about the great German and Austrian names in music that flourished during this period. But the cultural upsurge wasn't limited to the performing arts. It included as well the literary and philosophical traditions. German writers ceased deferring to France and began to establish an indigenous literary tradition. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe was born in 1749, began his rise to literary fame in the 1770s. I've already mentioned Immanuel Kant, whose critical philosophy in the 1780s demanded the attention of all the intellectuals of the day. The natural sciences, too, enjoyed new respect. That occurred as part of a larger development, the rise of a new approach to scholarship I want to tell you about, especially in the new academies that began to emerge in Germany. One of the earliest, for example, was the Academy of Sciences in the city of Göttingen. In these academies, there was an emphasis on something the Germans called Wissenschaft. Now, Wissenschaft is sometimes translated as science, but it has a more general meaning as well. It was a systematic scholarly study in a discipline. So philosophy could be a Wissenschaft. Even theology could be studied as a Wissenschaft. This emphasis on Wissenschaft, then, was an emphasis on the way you studied the subject. The result of this was to gradually affect the whole tradition of German scholarship. As the trend spilled over into the universities during the second half of the 18th century, it led to what has been called an ideology of Wissenschaft, particularly in the philosophy faculties of the universities. Where nature was concerned, you had Naturwissenschaft, natural science. Nature lent itself nicely to systematic study. In natural science, you paid particular attention to what you observed, to what the senses imparted. So the systematic study of nature in Germany during the second half of the 18th century contained a heightened appreciation of empirical research. Natural science was pursued at universities in the philosophy faculty. So this development brought new importance and new status with it for natural philosophers. This gives us a little background to the institutional context where the study of nature was pursued. Now let me indicate how the scientific subjects we'll be looking at over the entire course break down. Part 1 is called Science and the Enlightenment, and it comprises the first 12 lectures. Part 1 looks at the physical and biological sciences of the 18th century. Of course, we'll not only inquire about the scientific discoveries and the ideas of this period, we'll also ask about the political and social context in which natural science flourished. We'll want to know how that context affected what natural philosophers did, and in turn, how the work of those minds fascinated with nature helped to mold the social and cultural context itself. Now, we're going to be dealing with a variety of subject matter, so I've chosen to follow a theme to its conclusion rather than slavishly observing a chronological development. In other words, when a topic needs 2 lectures, we'll do them together, even though it might mean that we have to back up in time for the next topic. So we'll do several passes over the century as we look into individual themes. In parts 2 and 3 of the course, we'll look at the biological and physical sciences of the 19th century. Here, I've separated things into the biological and physical sciences, although you'll likely notice a few topics in which this separation just can't be maintained. In part 2, we'll look at life in its past, while part 3 I've entitled Physical Science and Culture in the 19th Century. Now, you might want to know how I've selected which material to include and what to exclude from this survey. Naturally, it comes down to my choice, and that from a wealth of possible topics. What you'll be getting is, of course, my take on these 2 centuries, and, incidentally, my occasional commentary on larger issues. But I've made an attempt to guard against just choosing to talk about those topics of interest to me. I've consulted those works in history of science that have taken a longer view, at least a century of time, to see what topics emerge as common themes in them. There aren't a lot of these kinds of works, but I've tried to detect patterns in those that do exist to construct a reasonable representation of the overall themes in the field. Where knowledge of the particulars is concerned, I've relied on the in-depth studies of individual episodes. There's a lot of that kind of work. In-depth, detailed writing constitutes by far the great bulk of historical scholarship. So, what will we be doing in this course? Well, naturally, we'll look at selected individual natural philosophers of the 18th and 19th centuries. They were inspired, as I mentioned, by their predecessors to push the limits of knowledge in a diversity of areas. But there are also some major themes, 6 of them to be precise, that seem to have emerged. First, I find fascinating in this period its inquiries about the history of the cosmos, specifically because they end up challenging the limited timescale of previous eras. This comes about when people begin to look for natural causes to explain how the Earth developed to its present state, as opposed to simply accepting the traditional supernatural explanations. Of course, if you're willing to push beyond the straightforward supernatural explanation of the creation, it means you have a lot to explain that gets passed over when you simply say God created the heavens and the earth. What you're doing is trying to give an answer to the question how God did it. We'll learn about the so-called nebular hypothesis that dared to offer a secular version of cosmic history that made God into an absentee landlord. And we'll see how the German mineralogical tradition tried to avoid grand hypotheses in order to establish a more empirically based explanation of the Earth's history and its geological features. Our second major theme has to do with the realm of living things, which fascinated natural philosophers over the entire 2 centuries. Presented with a spectacular diversity of species, naturalists compared them for similarities and differences and began arranging them into groups. In fact, as they pondered these comparisons, they concluded the various species of living things could be arranged on a scale of being. Now that brought with it a challenge. Can we come up with a classification of the living world that reflects God's plan in creating it? Is there a natural classification? Another intriguing question that occupied naturalists was the development of the embryo. It appeared to proceed from a formless mass to a fully formed adult. But what determined the direction the development was to take? Now that's not, I submit to you, an easy question to answer. But this was not an era that shied away from tough philosophical problems. On the contrary, the thinkers from these centuries relished such challenges. In the 19th century, natural philosophers uncovered the prehistoric world of creatures that roamed the earth in a distant past. Now imagine what kind of an impression that made on audiences in public lectures. A naturalist like Georges Cuvier could hold a crowd spellbound with his careful explanations of the fossil remains that were right there in front of him. An animal that roamed the earth before recorded history. Of course, there was an obvious question that lurked at the back of every mind. What about the antiquity and development of humans? Naturally, the inevitable happened. Eventually, well before Charles Darwin, I might add, there appeared secular explanations of humankind's past that challenged traditional religious accounts of how life began. Of course, we'll get to Darwin and all the hoopla that his new theory spawned, including ideas about how society should be run. In our third theme, we'll follow the route from the occult to chemistry. We'll assess the largely successful attempts to break away from occult explanations of chemical phenomena. The 18th century saw attempts to distinguish what one German called rational chemistry from alchemy. I think you'll find this story very interesting, especially since the way in which he sets up this rational chemistry is to create a system that we today have long since abandoned. Why? Well, in part at least because of the development of new experimental techniques that made possible the discovery of new gases, whose existence pushed the envelope of the German system. In addition, there appears a new quantitative approach in chemistry that starts making rules about how chemical research is to be done. This latter development occurs in France. It will be our first taste, but I assure you, not our last, of the role that national rivalries play in natural science. Now, one of the results that came from the attempt to distance chemistry from alchemy was, ironically, to move the future of chemical explanation away from what has been called the Newtonian dream, that is, the mastery of force laws. One might have expected that natural philosophers would try to do for chemistry what Newton had done for the heavens, and some tried. But the future of chemistry in the 19th century, one could almost say, lay in classification. Of course, it was a classification preceded by a revival of an ancient idea, atomism. And that turned out to be very productive indeed. Chemistry would discover that the periodicities elements displayed might be bewildering and mysterious, but getting the table right sure increased one's power. Well, not all of the themes we'll look at avoided unusual powers. In our fourth theme, we'll examine some very interesting, mysterious powers in nature. Some endeavors to explain natural phenomena admitted up front that new kinds of powers were at work. The world of medicine, for example, included in the 18th century a wide array of healers, from outright quacks to those who claimed to base their cures on theoretical knowledge. One of the wonderful stories in this vein is that of Franz Anton Mesmer, the German physician. The appearance of Mesmer's explanation of animal magnetism exposed how a rational explanation of a new force in nature could be affected by the interaction of social, intellectual, and especially political factors. I say political because Mesmer was in Paris in the years just prior to the French Revolution, and his salons soon fell under the watchful eye of the French police. Our Benjamin Franklin was there then too. And yes, he gets involved. We'll look again at medicine later in the 19th century when we get to Louis Pasteur. The fifth theme deals with the proliferation of physical forces, especially around the turn from the 18th to the 19th centuries. There were a lot of them, and the scientific investigation of their properties and their relationships opened up broad vistas for the future. Take, for instance, static electricity. Here is where Benjamin Franklin really shines. His quantitative explanation of electricity brought him enormous fame. But electricity's story didn't stop there. The discovery of animal electricity led to the invention of the battery and linked the physical and the biological sciences. And then electromagnetism astounded Europe, quickly finding practical application, plainly visible to laymen as well as experts. And what about the force of heat? It was the backbone of major inventions, especially in the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine. But it was not theoretically understood. It's from considerations of the characteristics of heat and its relation to other physical forces that led to sweeping generalizations about all forces. And this wasn't just technical information important only to experts. One of the generalizations contained dire consequences for the future of the cosmos itself. Did it square with traditional understandings of the end of the world? By mid-century, scientists, yes, we have scientists by this time, had so impressively depicted the physical world that some felt it was just a matter of time until we'd wrapped up all the knowledge that could be known. Oh yes, we have to keep refining the results, but nothing fundamentally new was ever going to replace the classical Newtonian mechanical understanding that had been forged. Cocky? Arrogant? I suppose. Understandably human, too. You'll know better what I mean by that after we've sampled the incredible achievements of 19th century physical science. Well, you guessed it. Precisely what some were saying could never happen, happened. We'll end our course with the stirrings of quantum theory and relativity that gave the lie to these predictions of completeness. Our final theme is one that runs through many of the first five, but I mention it here as a general concern. I mean the relation of God to nature. It keeps coming up over and over in the investigations of the 18th century science and right on through the biological and physical topics of the 19th century. One way of putting the basic issue is, if we are able to provide explanations based on mechanical laws, what about the role for supernatural agency? You can see how fundamental a question this was. Well, that's an introduction to what's ahead. Next time, we'll leap right into this issue of God's relationship to nature. It had been raised in earnest in the 17th century debate between Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz. By the end of the 18th century, many thinkers had adopted Newton's physics, but not Newton's God. How that all came about will be the subject of the next lecture.